Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Welcome back for another episode of Legal Tea. Today's topic is a current trend, something going on in the current time that is pertinent to my little estate and elder law world. So on today's episode, I happened to stumble upon an article on Jeffrey Epstein's estate, and it was specifically titled, Executors of Jeffrey Epstein's Estate Are Accused of Moving $13 Million. And I instantly thought, oh, that would be interesting to dive into on my podcast. So here we are. That's what today is on, Jeffrey Epstein's estate and the latest happenings going on with it, including the things his executors are doing, or trying to do rather. Let's start with Jeffrey Epstein as a person before we dive into his estate and what has happened lately with it. According to a Women's Health article by Emily Schiffer, Epstein, before he became really who he was actually a math and physics teacher in his 20s. Through that, he tutored the son of a head honcho at Bear Stearns, who ultimately got Epstein's foot in the door at the establishment. Eventually, Epstein became a limited partner, but time passed and he left the company to start his own in the early 1980s. That company was called Intercontinental Assets Group Incorporated, and shortly after its creation, he actually established two additional companies called J. Epstein and Company and Financial Strategy Group Incorporated. When he got into the financial arena, this is when Epstein really started running around in some elite circles. In my research for this episode, I found an article in the New York Magazine's Intelligencer website, that's of course linked to my sources, that described Epstein, his elite circles, and his general ways like this. Quote, "For decades, important, influential, serious people attended Epstein's dinner parties, rode his private jets, and furthered the fiction that he was some kind of genius hedge fund billionaire. How do we explain why they looked the other way or flattered Epstein, even as they must have noticed he was often in the company of a young woman? Easy. They got something in exchange from him." End quote. Yikes. So if somehow you've been living under a rock and you aren't familiar with the name Jeffrey Epstein, just know his name is associated with really not great things. Not great things at all. Dating back to the early 2000s, Epstein has been involved in legal proceedings, both criminal and civil, and most involved disgustingly inappropriate behavior involving girls, many of which were minors, in sex trafficking. Fast forward some time, Epstein's past caught up to him, and he was convicted of sex trafficking and conspiracy to engage in sex trafficking in July of 2019, according to a New York Times article. And while incarcerated, Epstein was found in the early hours on August 10th, dead in his cell. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that we're not going to get into. Was he murdered? Was it suicide? What was it? It was officially declared a suicide, though there's still many conspiracy theories out there. Nonetheless, we're not getting into those. Whatever happened, he passed away on August 10th, 2019. A mere 2 days before he died, according to a New York Post article, Epstein signed a new last will and testament. Epstein's will created a trust, which when you create a trust inside of a will, that is something called a testamentary trust. So that means any assets passing through Epstein's will would ultimately fall into this testamentary trust. And by the way, do you want to hear a little interesting tidbit? So wills often require two unbiased witnesses to sign along with the person signing their will. The two witnesses on Epstein's will were attorneys. One of those attorneys, according to the New York Post article, was none other than the attorney for the drug kingpin El Chapo. Kind of an interesting little tidbit. Maybe it's just me. Anyway, so back to his will. The will got filed in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is where Epstein held 2 properties, and specifically islands, because, he owned literal islands. The New York Post explained, via their legal expert, that Epstein's lawyers probably filed his will there to try to keep things private, or at least as private as they can be with this level of stuff going on. The will itself would not show, and nor would the legal proceeding, that would not show either who the beneficiary of the trust is. Because as we've discussed before on here, trust can be set up in a way to maintain privacy. But it's said that the trust beneficiary is probably his brother, Mark Epstein, and or maybe his girlfriend at the time. I'm probably going to butcher her name. Karina Shuliak is what we're going with. And she happened to be the last person Epstein talked to before he passed away. So who knows about that front, the beneficiaries? Who knows, where all this stuff is going? Anyways, one thing we do know for sure is that Epstein's past continues to haunt him, just through his estate. Prior to his death and even after, Epstein has been and continues to be sued by his accusers, his victims. So his estate and his executors have their hands full, to say the least. And speaking of executors, who are they? Well, according to New York Post, they are 2 longtime acquaintances of Epstein, an attorney named Darren Indike, and a businessman who happens to be an accountant, Richard Kahn, which leads us to one of the latest happenings of Epstein's case. And it's the article I mentioned at the very beginning. How they, the 2 executors, are accused of moving $13 million. So I wasn't really sure what I was exactly diving into when I started researching for this episode. But at this point in my research, I was like, whoa, this is far more complex than I really originally thought. So in my initial research, like I talked about a second ago, it talked a lot about Epstein's will and how that will created the testamentary trust I was just blabbing about. Well, this article and many other ones, once I got knee-deep into my research, started talking about another trust called the Butterfly Trust. According to the New York Times article, the Butterfly Trust was, quote, an investment vehicle Mr. Epstein had established in 2013, end quote. Okay, so the whole $13 million transfer comes into play with it. This all came to light because remember how I said all the filings occurred in the Virgin Islands? Well, the Attorney General for the Virgin Islands, someone named Denise George, is who is bringing all this to light. According to the article, George and her colleagues are raising questions about the transfer of $13 million. Apparently, on or around April 2020, an investment that Epstein had a stake in was liquidated. So the old Butterfly Trust got $13 million from that liquidation. Well then, according to the New York Times article, the money was transferred subsequently to 3 new entities. The catch? Well, 2 of those 3 entities have the attorneys Indike and Kahn, as well as their spouses, as the beneficiaries of said entities. Ruh-roh. So George, that Attorney General, is asking the court to dig into the transfer and these entities to, quote, make sure other estate assets have not been transferred to enrich the executors, end quote. Specifically, George's filing stated, quote, the government discovered that substantial funds kept secret from the government were transferred for the benefit of the co-executors in an apparent effort to enrich themselves and shelter those assets from recovery, end quote. The article continues on by mentioning that the same filing shares that the co-executors failed to mention that Epstein had loaned them several $1,000,000. Of course, to no one's surprise, Indike and Kahn responded and said that they, quote, categorically reject the baseless assertions of wrongdoing made against them, and that they never received $13 million, end quote. Their statement continued on, quote, the Butterfly Trust mentioned in today's filing by Ms. George has nothing whatsoever to do with Mr. Epstein's estate or any funds available to it, end quote. Though in direct relation to the estate and victims of Epstein's awful ways, the New York Times article shared that the Butterfly Trust had been tapped into to pay some of the people involved with Epstein recruiting and grooming teenage girls. So to me, it sounds like there's a game of finger pointing going on right now as to whether the Butterfly Trust is or is not part of Epstein's estate. And I think there is proof. I think there is evidence that it was used to do bad things that he did. And so maybe it can be kind of become part of Epstein's estate to help pay the victims in the many lawsuits he and his estate are involved in. So speaking of Miss George, she seems to have a bone to pick with Epstein and his estate. And probably, given what we all know about Epstein, rightfully so. According to the same New York Times article, the Virgin Islands went after Epstein's estate in January 2020, so just a couple years ago now. And they were trying to recoup $80 million because George, again, argued against Epstein and his estate, saying that, quote, the U.S. territory, speaking of the Virgin Islands, was deceived into granting lucrative tax benefits that enabled Mr. Epstein to use his private island residence there as a place to sexually abuse teenage girls and young women, end quote. So you remember how earlier I said they filed in the Virgin Islands to maintain some sense of privacy? Well, to me, it seems the Virgin Islands and Miss George has something to say about that. It is said that Epstein's estate is worth just north of $600 million at the time of his death, according to the New York Times article. But another New York Times article shared that when Epstein passed away, his estate contained quite the assortment of assets, including a lot of investments and financial holdings, private jets, helicopters, properties, including those islands we talked about, a mansion in Manhattan, a place in Palm Beach, Florida, an apartment in Paris, and a 7,600-acre farm in New Mexico. Not even counting his vast array of personal property, including a very extensive art collection. Though following his passing, his estate has paid close to $200 million in taxes and paid around $120 million in settlements for the victims. But the estate is clearly very much still in this pending stage. Is it really just worth $600 million? Is it worth more? Are things not being disclosed like the Butterfly Trust? And I'm sure the settlements are not done. I'm sure victims will continue to come forward, as they absolutely should. So what ends up going to his estate beneficiaries, whoever they are, is a big ol' TBD. What will come of the allegation regarding the executors and the $13 million? And what about the legal fees? Oh my goodness. According to a New York Times article, there has been over $30 million in just legal fees. And that article was published in January of 2022, so you know it's only continued to go up since then. So needless to say, this estate may be going on for a while, like so many estates that we talk about here on Legal Tea. There has been some talk about bringing the estate to a close and trying to make their way down the path to finish things out. But it just seems like there's still quite a bit lingering, so we'll just have to see, I suppose. Alrighty, next week's topic is on estate planning of the rich and famous. And on that episode, we're going to be talking about one of the former richest people in the world, Howard Hughes, and what happened estate-wise following his passing. There sure was some bizarre things that happened, so tune in next Tuesday, Legal Tea listeners, to hear all about it. Talk to you then, and stay well.